Arsène Wenger's 22 years at Arsenal was a tale of two halves. For nearly a decade, the Frenchman spearheaded a revolution full of success and history. He made Arsenal immortal. However, the last 14 years of his reign was plagued by regression, failure and disappointment, tainting the legacy he'd created. Let me explain the main reasons why Arsenal went from invincible to a laughingstock, and ultimately answer the question, was Arsène Wenger a failure? Before we look at these reasons and answer the question, we need to analyse both parts of his reign. In the 1990s, English football was undergoing a significant transformation. On the pitch, Man United were dominating the newly established Premier League, while off the pitch, all-seater stadiums were introduced. Hooliganism, which had been out of control in the 80s, was tackled properly, and grounds became far more welcoming to all types of fans, not just men. With the wealth the Premier League and also the new-look Champions League was starting to generate, it felt like English football was starting to modernise. Parallel to all this change, in late September 1996, Arsène Wenger arrived at Arsenal. Despite guiding Monaco to a French league title and winning 2 competitions during his brief spell in Japan, Wenger was relatively unknown in English football. But the Frenchman was a sign of the times. Nicknamed Le Professeur, Wenger revolutionised the way footballers approached their craft. In England, one of the areas of the game that hadn't yet modernised was sports science. Players still casually drank and were nowhere near as conscious about their bodies as they are now. Wenger banned his squad from drinking together. He also encouraged players to eat pasta as their pre-match dish, whilst also discouraging red meat and junk food. It didn't take long before the squad started to benefit from these changes, so other clubs took notice and followed suit. In England, Wenger single-handedly rewrote the definition of being a footballer from a job into a lifestyle. Additionally, he didn't fit the mould of being a manager in this country. With his slight and nerdy appearance, he stood out, but it was this methodical uniqueness that helped fuel his historic and remarkable Arsenal revolution. Playing a fast, aggressive and attractive style of play, over the next 8 years, Wenger led the club to 10 trophies. In 1998, he became the first manager not from the United Kingdom to win England's top flight. The 2003-04 season, which saw him win his 3rd Premier League title, was only the 2nd time in English football history a team went the whole season undefeated in the league. He'd made Arsenal invincible. Over this period, he went toe-to-toe with the dominant Sir Alex Ferguson and Man United, leading to some of the most historic games and moments the Premier League has ever seen. Loved and adored by Arsenal supporters, envied by clubs across Europe, the machine the Frenchman had created felt like it was only getting started. However, the invincible season was a clear line in the sand. From this point onwards, success and glory faded into a distant memory, and failure and frustration became the reality. Over the next 14 years, Arsenal won 4 FA Cups and 3 Community Shields. They also reached the Champions League final in 2006, narrowly losing out to Barcelona 2-1. Wenger also secured Champions League qualification 12 times, only missing out on 2 occasions. In the grand scheme of things, this is by no means a disaster, but when you compare it to what went before, it felt like one. Especially when you consider the fact the club went 9 years without a trophy between 2005 and 2014. Over this decade and a half, the love and admiration for Wenger among the Arsenal faithful was tested and ultimately waned. In the early years, with him at the helm, supporters believed that anything was possible. No trophy was out of reach, but by the end, league titles and Champions Leagues were a pipe dream. So, what caused this? Was Wenger responsible? Well, let's examine the 3 main reasons why this happened. At their best, Arsenal were a counter-attacking, aggressive and physically imposing team, but in 2005, Wenger reinvented the team style of play. There's no better representation of this change than when Wenger sold club captain Patrick Vieira in 2005 to accommodate the young Cesc Fabregas and the starting lineup. Wenger felt the 2 as a midfield pairing were ineffective and believed that prioritising the young Spaniard would benefit the club long term. Vieira had been crucial to the club's success ever since he followed Wenger through the door in 1996. He encapsulated all that Arsenal was: powerful, fast and elegant. Fabregas, on the other hand, signified what Wenger wanted the modern Arsenal to be: slower, more technical. He wanted to try and control games. Over the remainder of his time in charge, smaller, technical, by all means beautiful footballers were signed, with industrious players like Vieira no longer wanted. But this change proved to be unsuccessful. Arsenal soon picked up the stigma that they were weak and easily unsettled, but arguably, it wasn't the change of approach that hurt them in the long term. It was Wenger's stubbornness to stick with his style of play, even though it wasn't working. Over the subsequent years, Arsenal became far more predictable and easier to play against, the complete opposite of what they once were. In 2006, Arsenal moved from their beloved and historic home Highbury to the Emirates Stadium. Their new ground increased home capacity from 38,000 to 60,000, and the commercial opportunities the new stadium provided boosted the club's annual revenue to record heights. But this all came at a cost. The entire project totalled £390 million. As a result of this huge expenditure, Wenger's transfer purse for the following seasons was squeezed and tightened, as the club started to pay off the debt. When you compare the club's net spend to their competitors, you see the significant impact the new stadium had on their transfer dealings. Over the decade following the move, Arsenal's rivals' average net spend was £462.3 million, over 4 times more than the Gunners. This context is crucial when evaluating Wenger's final years at the club. Despite operating under financial constraints, Wenger was still burdened with the same expectations from the national media and Arsenal supporters to compete for the top honours he had done previously. When you factor this in, Wenger's ability to deliver trophies and maintain Arsenal's Champions League status is quite remarkable. In 2011, American businessman Stan Kroenke gained majority control of Arsenal. Since then, he's become one of the more well-known Premier League club owners, but for all the wrong reasons. Only recently, with his son Josh now in charge of day-to-day operations, has the anger from supporters turned from shouts to whispers. Whilst he's still universally disliked among the fans, Arsenal are more united than ever under his ownership. But that unity was entirely absent during Wenger's time at the club. He's always been a distant owner. He'd initially promised to engage with fans and have them involved in club decisions, but he's rarely fulfilled this vow. Additionally, he's been blamed for not just accepting mediocrity at the club, but creating it. Under his stewardship, targets have been lowered from league titles to just finishing in the top 4 for its financial benefits. Kroenke seemed happy to do the bare minimum in the transfer market. This lack of ambition manifested itself when Arsenal sold Robin van Persie to bitter rivals Man United in 2012. The Dutchman had spent 8 years in North London, and he was, by a mile, the club's best and most important player. His contribution to Man United was significant, finishing top scorer in the league in the season he signed, helping them win their 20th top-flight title. From the point Kroenke secured majority control, Wenger had to face the noise from scenarios like this all on his own, whilst the American hid on the other side of the Atlantic. All the pent-up frustration and anger the supporters rightly had towards their owner was directed at Wenger. Of course, Wenger wasn't blameless in this. He could have done more to stop Arsenal slipping from their perch at the top of English football. He could have stood up to Kroenke, but unquestionably, he shouldered a lot of the blame that Kroenke cowered from. During Wenger's reign, Stan Kroenke owned Arsenal, not for sporting glory, but for ego and status. It's only since securing 100% ownership in 2018, and with his son overseeing the running of the club, that idea is being slowly put to bed. Following the Champions League final defeat in 2006, and after exactly a decade in charge of the club, Arsène Wenger should have stepped down. He should have closed his Arsenal chapter. Instead, Wenger, through sheer love for the club or self-belief in his abilities, perhaps arrogance, made Arsenal his entire book. At that time, his stock was so high, a move to another elite club would have been on the cards. As a result of not taking this next step, Wenger has allowed the question of him being a failure go from laughable to credible. When evaluating his time at Arsenal, you can see he wasn't a failure. The success he achieved and the history he wrote in the first part of his tenure is unquestionable. He revolutionised Arsenal and English football. Yes, in the latter part of his reign, he was too stubborn tactically, believed he was the best man for the job when perhaps he no longer was, and played a part in letting standards slide. But he was clearly operating in an environment where success was impossible to achieve. Sadly, for Arsène Wenger's sake, the final 14 years at the club are at the forefront of people's minds. Only history books and some Arsenal supporters will truly remember Wenger when he was a success. That's why many consider Arsène Wenger a failure, even though he's clearly not.